It's hard to imagine, but even extremely egocentric and controlling people carry fear inside. Those who appear firm, who use charm as a weapon, and who constantly try to steer others like pieces on a chessboard, usually hide cracks they don't want anyone to see. Now think, what if you knew exactly which behaviors make this type of person lose their stability? What if you learned how to shield yourself, without arguing, without over-explaining, and without being dragged into chaos? Stoic discipline is not meant to win arguments. It exists to help you gain mastery over yourself, and that is what dismantles any emotional game. In this content, you will discover 10 things that terrify this manipulative profile, and how to use Stoic principles to reclaim your autonomy. Pay close attention, because this knowledge can completely change the way you respond to those who try to push your triggers. Fear 1. Failing to control your reactions. This type of person sustains themselves through the power of directing the environment. They read the emotional climate of a conversation, identify insecurities, observe your sensitive points, and then begin to experiment. Today they use praise to pull you in. Tomorrow they use criticism to break you. Then they go silent to make you anxious, and afterward they return as if nothing happened. It is a continuous testing pattern. They push a little, pull back, push again, constantly calibrating how much they can steer you. If they notice that you over-explain, they start demanding justifications. If they sense that you fear rejection, they threaten to withdraw. If they understand that you seek approval, they alternate affection and contempt to keep you hooked. It's like someone driving a car. They turn the emotional steering wheel and expect you to follow every curve. The goal is rarely to resolve anything. The goal is to confirm dominance. That's why what they cannot tolerate is the moment when the strategy fails. You don't react as expected. You don't enter the game. You don't return aggression. You don't try to convince, you don't chase, you don't humiliate yourself, you don't argue for hours. You simply remain centered. For this profile, that is terrifying because it reveals a truth they try to hide. Without your reaction, they have no real power. It's like someone who spent a lifetime pressing buttons and getting predictable responses. And suddenly, the buttons no longer trigger anything. They press harder, press repeatedly, change techniques, and nothing happens. The lack of effect becomes a shock. This is where Stoicism enters as a mental technology. It doesn't teach you how to defeat the other person. It teaches you how not to be governed by stimuli. The external world is not your territory of control. People, opinions, moods, and others' intentions are outside your reach. But your mind, your choices, and your posture are your territory. When you truly understand this, you stop negotiating with the storm and start building shelter within. In practice, Stoic self-control means 3 simple things, yet devastating for any manipulator. You distinguish fact from narrative. Provocations come loaded with story. You always, you never, no one can stand you. The Stoic separates them. What is verifiable data, and what is an attempt to push you into guilt, fear, or anger. This separation cuts half the power of the attack. You choose your response instead of reacting. Reaction is automatic, response is deliberate. The manipulator lives off impulse. If they can speed you up, they drive. When you pause, literally, you take the wheel of your life back. Sometimes the greatest act of strength is staying silent for 5 seconds and calmly deciding what actually makes sense. You don't provide emotional payment. The provocateur's reward is seeing you shake, explain yourself, beg, cry, shout, apologize for what you didn't do, or doubt yourself. When they don't receive that payment, they feel they invested energy and got no return. And without return, they either lose interest or escalate the attack, which by itself exposes the mechanism. That's why when your stability becomes consistent, manipulation hits a wall. They try to irritate you and fail. They try to confuse you and you ask for clarity. They try to provoke guilt and you return to your values. They try to put you on trial and you refuse to enter the courtroom. Their frustration grows because their favorite method, making you lose your center, no longer works. And here is the most important point. Remaining calm is not being cold, nor is it swallowing injustice. Serenity is refusing the role of a puppet. It is not allowing someone direct access to the control panel of your mind. You can set boundaries, end conversations, step away, and say no firmly without delivering the emotional explosion that fuels the game. When you sustain this freedom, the manipulator is forced to face something that terrifies them. A person who cannot be driven by triggers. And that changes everything, because they understand, even if they never admit it, that their power always depended on one thing: your reaction. Without it, all that remains is the emptiness of lost control. Fear, 2. Being treated as irrelevant. For a narcissistic manipulator, attention is not merely desirable, it is essential to their very sense of existence. They need to be seen, referenced, remembered, mentioned directly or indirectly. Every glance, every reply, every emotional reaction functions as a silent confirmation of importance. That is why they create situations, provoke conflicts, exaggerate gestures or words, anything to ensure the spotlight remains on them. When this flow is interrupted, something internal begins to collapse. Without attention, the ego loses its support, like a structure built on applause that suddenly stops. It is exactly like a brightly lit theater, the set prepared, the actor on stage, but with empty seats. They speak, perform, provoke, and receive no response at all. This absence of response is deeply unsettling because it dismantles the manipulator's internal logic. They expect a reaction: anger, defense, explanation, guilt, anything that confirms they still occupy space in your mind. When that doesn't happen, they begin to doubt their own impact. Attempts to draw attention intensify, provocations become more obvious, the tone shifts, and still nothing. Silence and neutrality begin to weigh more heavily than any direct confrontation. This is where the Stoic posture proves extremely effective. Indifference here does not mean contempt or artificial coldness. It means lucidity, the conscious choice not to invest energy in what does not contribute to your stability, your values, or your peace of mind. You see the bait, recognize the game, and decide not to play. You don't retaliate against provocations, you don't engage in circular arguments, and you don't try to win debates that exist only to drain you. You refuse to be pulled into arenas that lead nowhere. The more you preserve your energy, the clearer it becomes to the manipulator that they no longer occupy a central position in your life. They realize they no longer dictate your mood, define your emotional rhythm, or influence your decisions. What was once an exclusive stage becomes nothing more than an empty space where they speak to themselves. And this disturbs them deeply, because it exposes an uncomfortable truth, the importance they believed they had depended entirely on your participation. By adopting this conscious indifference, you reclaim control of your own attention, one of the most valuable assets there is. The manipulator, meanwhile, finds themselves displaced, unsure how to regain the lost spotlight. And while they struggle to return to the center, you move forward, lighter, more focused, and increasingly inaccessible to the emotional games that once held you captive. Fear 3. Facing what they hide, within this profile, there is an almost compulsive need to appear flawless. The image of strength, superiority, and certainty must be maintained at all costs because it functions as armor. Behind this well-polished facade, however, there are often deep insecurities, old fears, and an extremely fragile identity. Precisely for this reason, any situation that exposes inconsistencies, mistakes, or vulnerabilities is experienced as a threat. It is not merely discomfort, it is panic. Facing flaws would mean admitting that the constructed image is not real, and that is something they desperately avoid. Self-examination becomes an enemy, like a mirror that reveals what they spend their life trying to hide. Because of this, they project. Instead of looking inward, they point outward. They criticize, belittle, expose others' flaws, and use past mistakes as emotional ammunition, all to keep the illusion of superiority intact. Anyone who accepts their own imperfections threatens this system because it breaks the game's core logic. If acknowledging flaws does not destroy you, then why would it destroy them? That silent question destabilizes them. The Stoic moves in the opposite direction. They do not build their worth on a perfect image, but on internal coherence. They recognize limits without shame, admit mistakes without theatrics, and learn from them without endless self-punishment. There is no drama, no need for self-flagellation, no attempt to appear invincible. There is clarity, and this posture creates a direct clash with the manipulator's mindset. When you do not hide your flaws, they cease to be weapons against you. When you accept your vulnerabilities, the other person loses the power to use them as leverage. Criticism stops cutting deeply because you already know yourself. Attacks lose force because they find no hidden weak points to exploit. Those who accept themselves do not live in a constant state of defense, and that completely changes the power dynamic. For the manipulator, dealing with someone like this is deeply unsettling. They try to provoke shame and encounter serenity. They try to expose weaknesses and find maturity. They try to generate guilt and meet balanced responsibility. In this scenario, the game breaks because the fear that sustained control no longer exists. And when someone does not fear being imperfect, they become nearly impossible to dominate. Fear 4. Losing control of their own reputation. For the narcissistic manipulator, reputation is not a consequence of who they are, but a carefully engineered project. Every word, every gesture, and every story told is part of a polished mask designed to generate admiration, respect, or even fear. They don't just want to be seen, they want to be seen in a very specific way. That is why they invest so much energy in controlling narratives, adjusting versions of events, and shaping how others perceive them. The problem arises when this construction begins to fail, when the story no longer convinces, when contradictions appear, or when people stop buying the image. That is when the internal alarm goes off. Losing control of their own reputation feels, for this profile, like losing the ground beneath their feet. They sense they no longer dominate the environment, that they can no longer predict how they will be interpreted. This generates anxiety, irritation, and desperate attempts to regain control. Excessive justifications, veiled attacks, playing the victim, or discrediting those who threaten the carefully built image. All of this reveals how fragile appearances are when they depend entirely on the gaze of others. Stoicism dismantles this mechanism at its root. It teaches that character weighs more than applause, and that living for external approval is a subtle form of slavery. When you act according to internal values, without the obsession to please or impress, you become unpredictable to the manipulator. They can no longer steer you through fear of what people will think, because that fear simply does not govern your decisions. This autonomy is deeply disturbing to someone who lives off image. The manipulator realizes they cannot pull you through the need for acceptance, cannot shame you, and cannot pressure you with others' opinions. You don't panic over rumors, you don't compulsively explain yourself, and you don't adjust your behavior to preserve a flawless appearance. And in doing so, you expose what they tried desperately to hide. An identity built solely on approval is fragile, while those grounded in their own character remain steady, even when the applause disappears. Fear. 5. Encountering someone with inner security. Nothing irritates a controller more than coming across someone who is not negotiating their own identity. People with inner security don't need to constantly prove their worth, don't seek approval like oxygen, and don't bow to aggressive opinions. They know who they are, understand their limits, recognize their own merit without needing an audience, and don't depend on anyone else's mood to remain stable. For a manipulator, this is a terrible scenario because they lose their primary tool, the ability to play with your doubts. That's why they try everything. First comes subtlety. Innocent remarks, disguised irony, comparisons, small provocations that seem like jokes. If that doesn't work, they escalate. More direct criticism, insinuations about your competence, attacks on your character, attempts to put you on the defensive. The intention is simple, to open a crack. They need you to question yourself, because insecurity is the doorway through which they gain control. But when you don't waver, the game stalls. It's like throwing stones at a fortress. It makes noise, tires the arm, but doesn't bring the structure down. What frustrates them even more is realizing that you don't react by justifying yourself. You don't enter disputes to prove who's right, and you don't need to win in order to feel valid. You may listen, evaluate, and adjust what makes sense, but without humiliating yourself, without feeling guilty for existing, and without chasing approval. This posture communicates something the manipulator hates. I don't depend on you to feel whole. And for someone who lives off control, that is a silent defeat. Stoic strength is born precisely at this point. It doesn't come from applause, praise, or admiration. It comes from inner alignment, clear values, stable principles, and emotional discipline. The Stoic builds self-worth from coherence, not from external validation. They ask, is this aligned with what I consider right, rather than, will this earn me approval? That difference changes everything, because the manipulator loses their point of entry. If you don't need permission to respect yourself, they can't manipulate you through its absence. Moreover, Stoicism teaches a kind of confidence that is not arrogance. It is firmness without display. It is knowing your worth while remaining humble enough to learn. It is not being a hostage to praise that inflates you, nor to criticism that tears you down. When you operate at this level, the controller realizes that their traditional weapons, shame, guilt, social pressure, and doubt, hit and bounce back. In the end, what truly frightens this profile is not your physical strength, your perfect response, or your ability to argue. It is your stability. It is realizing that you are not fertile ground for emotional games. And when they understand that, they often retreat, change targets, or seek another form of control, because with you, the main door is closed. Have you ever experienced a situation where your firmness made someone stop trying to diminish you? Write in the comments. Your experience may help others recognize signs that often go unnoticed. Fear. 6. Being confronted by facts. Manipulators thrive on confusion, half-truths, shifting versions, stories that constantly change. But reality is an enemy that does not negotiate. When you bring clarity, they squirm. Light unsettles those who operate in the shadows. Stoic ethics value honesty and coherence. When you keep a conversation anchored in facts, without shouting, without attacking, the manipulator loses the ability to distort. And when lies find no fertile ground, the game collapses. Fear. 7. Being excluded and losing social relevance. Being admired, desired, included, these things feed the ego. The idea of no longer being the center or of being left out generates panic. For them, rejection is not just uncomfortable, it is a wound. Stoicism teaches independence. Your value does not depend on the group. When you refuse to bend yourself just to be accepted, the manipulator realizes they can no longer use social fear as a leash. You continue on your path with dignity, and that disarms them. Fear 8. Being unable to use money as leverage. In many cases, resources become tools of power, gifts with strings attached, help laced with blackmail, control through dependency. When you become financially autonomous, or when you make it clear that you will not sell your peace, the manipulator loses one of their favorite weapons. The Stoics defend simplicity and inner freedom. Those who are not enslaved by status are not easily bought, and when money no longer controls you, their control shrinks. Fear 9. Encountering someone emotionally independent. This profile feeds on others' vulnerability, guilt, fear, emotional neediness, and the hunger for approval. But when you learn to regulate your emotions, they can no longer fish for reactions. They poke and receive calm silence. They provoke and meet neutrality. Stoicism is training, observing emotions without being dragged by them. When you don't explode, don't beg, and don't constantly justify yourself, manipulation loses its effect. And that is an intimate defeat for someone who has always won through emotional exhaustion. Fear 10. Being alone with their own conscience. For this type of person, solitude is a hallway with no distractions, without an audience, without validation, without noise. What remains is an encounter with their own insecurities, and that is exactly what they avoid. That's why they seek constant motion, people nearby, social media, shallow conversations, drama, turbulent romance, anything that fills the void. It's not company as affection, it's company as anesthesia. Silence is dangerous because it can reveal who they are when they're not performing. When they realize you don't fear being alone, they lose yet another tool of control, abandonment as a threat. You'll end up alone is powerful against someone with emotional dependency. But against someone who genuinely knows how to live well in their own company, it has no impact. If you don't fear the void, no one can govern you through fear of loss. The Stoic learns to transform solitude into strength. They use time alone to reflect, review decisions, strengthen values, and train serenity. For them, being alone isn't punishment, it's space for inner construction. When you feel comfortable in your own company, you don't depend on anyone to hold you up. And when the manipulator realizes they can't scare you with abandonment, they lose another lever. What used to be a threat becomes for you freedom. Now that you know what destabilizes a narcissistic manipulator, the next step is consistency. This isn't about defeating someone, it's about not losing yourself while dealing with someone. Less reaction and more presence, less explanation and more boundaries, less fear and more self-control. Every time you choose serenity over impulse, you strengthen your autonomy. Every time you choose facts over drama, you reduce the space for distortion. Every time you stay loyal to your values, you become harder to manipulate. If you've ever recognized the fragility behind a mask of confidence, share in the comments what happened and how you handled it. That can open a lot of people's eyes. And if you want to keep learning practical strategies to strengthen the mind and live with more autonomy, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We're in this journey together.